But I want to welcome everybody. This is today's webinar, AI in Public Safety, Separating Signal from Hype. I'm Josh Ederheimer, and I am your stand-in moderator because we wanted Dr. McClellan to be on the panel. We're really covering a topic today that is of interest to public safety. AI and the technology related to AI is transforming the profession and how in public safety we are doing our jobs, whether it's investigations, crime analysis, forensics, and frankly, all kinds of emergency response. So in the next hour, we're just going to talk about, it's like a primer. What is AI? What does that even mean in public safety? How is AI being used? What obstacles are we seeing as it relates to the use of AI? And what about public perception and public support of how public safety is using AI? So what we've done today is we've brought together three distinguished leaders and practitioners from public safety, all three who I've had the pleasure of working with, and I just know that they bring some truly unique perspectives. Again, I'm Josh Ederheimer. I'm a assistant professor at the University of Virginia and a failed retiree from federal law enforcement and local law enforcement. I'm one of the senior directors in the new Center for Public Safety and Justice at UVA. Speaking of the Center for Public Safety and Justice at UVA, I welcome Dr. Sara McClellan. She's an associate professor here at the University of Virginia, and she brings more than 20 years of experience as a practitioner and consultant and academic, real smart person, focused on public administration, organizational change, and leadership. She has been really leading the center's work on AI and public safety and teaching our public safety executives on artificial intelligence and technology, among other things. And we're so happy to have her on the panel. Next, you can see Michael Boyce. I first met Mike Boyce in my days in the Department of Homeland Security. I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago. Michael, he was the founding director of the DHS AI Corps. And this is where he built this team of extremely qualified experts on delivering AI capabilities across DHS and frankly, the federal government. He is now a senior advisor to the state of Maryland and Governor Moore, advising on AI issues and AI leadership and AI adoption. Our third panelist, who will be on hopefully very soon, but I'm going to introduce him anyway, is the Chief of Police from Fort Collins, Colorado, Chief Jeff Swoboda. Before coming to Colorado and becoming the chief, he spent 26 years with the Elgin, Illinois Police Department. He was the chief there. That's how he ended his career. He has 3 decades of police leadership experience, and he's been actively involved in this national conversation on AI and public safety. He's been speaking as an expert practitioner around the country, and he's been dealing with some unique issues in AI from a practitioner standpoint recently. And when he comes on, we have a couple questions for him. So with that, I am going to actually start with a question for Dr. McClellan, and then I'm going to rotate through a couple of different questions. But I think we should start from the beginning. So at the top level, Dr. McClellan, Sara, so how do you define AI? What makes it distinctive from other or older technologies? And I heard you speak at an event last week. So the third part of my question is that you described AI as a charismatic technology. And you could talk a little bit about that as well. So how do you define AI? How is it distinctive? And what is a charismatic technology?
Thank you, Josh. In terms of defining AI, I'm gonna cede ground on the technical definition to Michael, and I'm going to talk a little bit more conceptually. Of course, many of us encounter AI in tools like Claude or ChatGPT or Copilot, and we're thinking of it as a sort of query tool. I want to expand that concept a little bit and think about it as a tool with real socio-political impact and ramifications. And so I've been looking at a lot of different definitions from practitioners and from scholars. And I think historian and philosopher Yuval Noah Harari really articulates well three ways in which AI is different than prior technologies. And I think the first way is that AI is an agent. It's not just an automated tool. And Michael and I have talked about this a lot. We're kind of used to automated tools that have parameters that we establish and have reasonable control over. AI is capable of deciding and acting in ways that we don't always fully understand and control. Second, AI is generating truly new, novel concepts. So we're seeing that if we're using these common generative AI tools. And third, AI can shape and manipulate human psychology in a generative manner that we don't always notice, we don't always reflect on. So, for example, as I interact with AI, the experience might increase or decrease my motivation to engage around a particular task. It might change the way I feel about myself and my work. It might also impact how I view my coworkers. If I think AI supercharges their capacity, or I think AI, we talk about work slop and quality issues, if I think it is creating capacity challenges, that's going to impact trust in my organization. And so there's no perfect analogy when we compare technologies. People will always debate what something is like, but I would say AI is a lot closer to electricity than it is to a calculator, in that it has the power to transform parts of our workforce across professions and across industries. It's already shifting geopolitical conversations and relationships. It's helping us solve crucial health problems. And it's also changing or disrupting the way that we learn and the way we work. And you asked about a charismatic technology. This was a term coined by Morgan Ames in 2015 to describe technology that we're drawn to that promises action. So it's this notion of promised action and not necessarily what the technology is or does in a particular case. And it's almost this sort of magical thinking that comes with awe or amazement. And that sometimes overrides the rational thought that we need to do about how people actually work, how people actually integrate the technology. And so sometimes we skip over those more challenging and complicated questions about integration within existing organizations to either advocate or scapegoat the technology, when really some of the most important questions, I would argue, are the human decisions, processes, and tools that underlie the way that technology shows up for us.
Thank you, Sara. Really interesting perspectives. Um, Michael, a question for you. You know, I forgot to mention in your intro that your most important job is being a professor here at the University of Virginia and teaching our law enforcement and public safety executives, co-teaching with Sara on AI. But you, aside from your incredible background teaching at the University of Virginia, you have some unique perspectives in that you've kind of been here almost at the operational perspective, implementing it in both the federal government and the local government. So, Michael, what do you see as the biggest differences or things that are the same or the challenges uh, between the federal government and the local government when it comes to adopting AI?
Yeah, I mean, let me just take a step back there in that, I think Sarah nicely described AI, but I think one point of it is, you know, if we had a hand raising feature, I would ask folks to raise their hands if you've used AI today. And my hunch is usually what happens is 50% of people would raise their hands, and then I would say, yep, it was a trick question. Every single person has used AI today, I guarantee you, without a doubt. In fact, we are using AI as I am speaking right now. The whole reason that, if you have your speakers on, you don't hear a terrible echo is because there's an AI algorithm preventing my voice from echoing as we are talking. And so when we talk about AI adoption, the other thing I would say is, have you done a Google search today? Google search is by every definition an AI technology, um, that every legal definition that I've seen. Now, I think what people are talking about often and will flip back and forth between is AI and then a category of AI, usually referred to as generative AI, which is what we think about when we think about ChatGPT and Claude. And so then there we talk about a different sort of adoption and a different sort of adoption set of circumstances that we are thinking about. But find your law, and find your legal definition. AI is a technology that we've all used in our lives, and we're probably using right now to a certain extent. So I think on that adoption point, I like to point out that there's big pieces of this that are not new. Now, what's captured our attention, which captured our economy, and the other piece that I like to also mention to folks is right now, we imagine, folks in the 1880s or whatever living through the building of the railroad and the railroad system. We are going through an industrial change that is similar in size to that. And, when I see an old-timey movie, there'll be a montage. Well, we are right now in that montage right now. Um, and so um, and so it's sort of hard to put that into perspective when you're actually living through it, but it is similar in size and scope, and it rightfully captures people's attention. And so then you get to the federal and state level. And look, I would say, to be honest, Josh, a lot of it is pretty similar. A lot of it is, they're all government, it's all turtles all the way down. It's all government. And so then the question is that you're dealing with those fundamental things that make up what governments look like. You have, generally, most state governments are organized very similar to the federal level. There's maybe minor differences in sort of how departments are categorized, or how centralized IT is, or how dispersed IT is. But in general, it's a lot of the same themes of you're relying on all the normal authorities that we do to manage the business of government, whether that's procurement, whether that's hiring, whether that's budget. And of course, whether that's policy and the laws. And I will say right now, at least in the state of Maryland, many of our policies we have on the books really follows and takes lead from many of the federal examples, which I always make sure when I'm teaching with Sara, when we talk about AI, talks about AI regulation writ large, but actually we've now, since the Biden administration had a fairly consistent, even going into Trump 2, fairly consistent governance policies to how AI is used internally inside of the federal government. And I know that when you read the news, it might not feel like that, but when you actually look at the controlling bits of policy, they are quite similar in many regards. And I would say the biggest difference is, of course, on emphasis, right? So I would say that certainly the second Trump administration has been more vocal about rapid AI adoption. I think someone argued potentially at the expense of kind of governance and oversight. I'd say in a state like Maryland, which is really proud of its AI adoption, we've also made a real commitment to governance and strong policies. And so those are some of the things that I think we've seen writ large across the board.
But I want to jump right into controversy and related to what Mike Boyce just talked about. You have been facing some obstacles with what I like to call as AI-assisted technology, flock cameras. So a lot of people on this webinar may not know what's been going on and what you've had to face and how you dealt with it. But so my first question is, what the heck happened in Fort Collins with flock cameras? And it's my understanding that your department has had success with flock cameras, but there was a significant community pushback in the realm really concerns, I believe, about privacy, surveillance, and trust. So what happened in Fort Collins, and what are the implications for Fort Collins and the profession?
So in a nutshell, we've been with Flock for about 2 years. I won't go into what Flock is. I'm sure most people are somewhat know. A license plate reading system uses AI to understand what types of vehicles, damage on vehicles, and things like that. So we've been using it for about 1.5 years. There was significant pushback in the community referencing concerns about data privacy, concerns about who owns the data, what's happening with the data. There had been multiple reports around the country and even here in Colorado about abuse of the system. So there was a lot of conversations happening around Flock. I like to say, I think it was a great example of local government in action, exactly, in my opinion, how it's supposed to work. The people who we police with have a say in the types of technology that the police department is going to use in an effort to keep them safe. So many people came out, were concerned with it. Obviously, like most things, everyone didn't speak on this. Many were quiet; they were fine with it. But some who were didn't like the technology, thought it was a bridge too far, came to City Council. City Council gave us an opportunity to explain why we were using the technology, the successes we had with it, and in the end, they wanted us to end the contract with Flock and really start to put together a surveillance policy that really gets into, if we're going to be using this type of technology, it's license plate reader today, it's facial recognition tomorrow, it's drones the day after, all those things. How do we decide what we're going to utilize, that the police department just doesn't operate in a vacuum and can do whatever they want? So how does the council and the community get notified of the technology we're using? So we're in the process of finalizing a surveillance policy, we're calling it. And in the end, that'll be presented to council, which will actually be nice because it will give us a kind of a roadmap of, if we want to utilize certain technologies going forward, how do we let people know that we're utilizing it? And so I look at it as a very successful story because the community had a say in the tools and technology the police department was using. And in the end, we are not using that license plate reading system. But in the future, I do see some ALPR at some level coming back to Fort Collins. Who knows when, though?
So, Chief, that's interesting. I did not realize that there was a different possible outcome, that it's just not a kibosh on the use of Flock, but time to develop a policy that's acceptable and has the support of the public. How do you see, as a follow-up, we've seen now police officers, not in Fort Collins, but around the country, that have abused the system, that have been accessing the Flock data, for personal reasons and inappropriate use. And part two of that, we have also seen agencies sharing the data with federal law enforcement. I don't know if Mike has an opinion on that. What would your advice be to chiefs, before they deploy Flock or other AI technology?
Yeah, I like the way we're doing it here in Fort Collins because we're really doing an overarching policy that basically lets the community know, before we go and purchase certain equipment, certain tools, certain technology, we're going to have this kind of set up. A big part of our conversations have been with the agreements, the contracts that we sign with companies. And so it can be spelled out very clearly who owns the data, who has access to the data, what are the ramifications if people breach the data, whether a breach from the outside or a misuse internally. And I can tell you, I've been doing this over 30 years now, and it's not uncommon, unfortunately, that you hear a story about somebody using some data system for a means that's not authorized. And so I know police officers or professional staff members, probably throughout the history of policing, have been disciplined or even terminated their employment or potentially arrested because they're misusing a system that wasn't designed for a certain use. So it's not just a ALPR system that is being misused. It's something that unfortunately happens too often. And so I think a big part of the conversations we're having with the community, and that there needs to be significant trust, is that we're auditing these systems ourselves. And we have robust auditing features that we are going to hold people accountable. We're going to be transparent when somebody does misuse a system. So I think that takes, like they say, you can't make a friend when you need one. It's really more about building up the whole idea of trust and legitimacy in the community from day one, and talking about these things, and not just dropping, a new technology on and saying, trust, we're here from the government, trust us, we're going to use it appropriately. So it's really about being open about what we're using, explaining to people how we're going to hold ourselves accountable, and then being honest about it when there is a misuse of the system, and make sure we're holding those accountable if they do misuse the system. So like anything with trust and legitimacy, it just takes time and more conversations. And again, today it's ALPR, but tomorrow will be whatever technology is coming down. So
Right. So really chiefs need to get ahead of it and start thinking about how they would implement anything, and put some controls and guidelines in place and then enforce it. So thank you, Chief. So there should be a button on your screens. If any of you have any questions, go ahead and plug your questions in, and then we'll get to questions from viewers. But while that is happening, I'm going to go back to Dr. McClellan. So we have sort of a divisive political landscape as it relates to the acceptance of AI. As from your view, why do you think people are uneasy about AI? And same to you, what would you suggest to police leaders what they should do to allay the public's concerns about its implementation?
That's a great question. And I want to start by actually not talking about AI, because I think we're in an especially tricky period where any new technology or innovation is emerging at a time when public trust in institutions in the US is exceptionally low. And so if you look at Gallup's latest poll on trust in institutions conducted in June, it shows public confidence in 12 out of 14 key institutions at or near the lowest point since Gallup began that survey in I think it was 1993. And only 17% of the Americans surveyed reported having a great deal of confidence in public safety, and the same percentage of confidence, 17%, in big business. And so, although we do experience political polarization, especially related to trust in institutions, I think we see a lot of reporting sources that are capturing concerns about technologies of all different types, and not just AI. And it cuts across party lines. And so if we look at, for example, start to move towards AI and look at data centers, we see in a lot of the stories and the headlines in the recent months that it's left, right, and center are concerned or unsettled about AI, but about a lot of other issues in our country as well. And so if you think about it, one of the things that I think is important to attend to, we still see people with much more favorable perspectives on local government than other levels of government or other institutions. So to the extent that local governments can set themselves apart and be as connected as possible and communicative as possible, I think that's probably advisable. For example, a recent Pew survey found US citizens trust police leaders more than they trust the leaders of technology companies. And so I share that because some public safety agencies might be tempted to foreground vendor commentary or claims about AI, especially if you get into tricky territory. But this might actually be counterproductive given the low levels of public trust in technology companies and leaders. And we also saw a 2024 Pew study found that Americans believe they have decreasing control over how AI is used in their lives. And those surveyed also said they want more control. And so if you think about that related to public safety in itself is a place where sometimes people identify police authority with the potential loss of control. And so now you have two sort of fears of lost control coming together. And so I think one of the things that also happens is, where can people voice those concerns, those fears? It's pretty tough for them to talk directly with the technology CEO or somebody in a big federal agency, but they can show up after work and confront a police chief or a council. And so I think some of this is, where is it bubbling up? And it may not always be about local technology concerns, it may be spillover effect. But this is where I think government, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to connect with people about those fears and understand them better. If you saw the recent Wall Street Journal article, I think it was just yesterday, talking about FLoC and the different interests aligning around FLoC concerns, there are a lot of different perspectives and interests. Even if we talk about the anti-flock movement, it's not a monolith. And so I think understanding and listening is probably the first best place to start in this polarized, tricky political environment.
So Sarah, just as I look at some of the questions that are popping up on in the question box, it's kind of related to something that you said. Anthony Fung this question is really about private sector startups and that they're starting to develop AI solutions in this area. And basically, what advice would you give private sector startups to help them guide and develop the use of AI and to address some of the issues that were discussed so far?
Mm-hmm. I would go to much the same place and start with listening and listening deeply. So as people are offering challenges, raising fears, try to dig underneath that to see what are some of the explanatory frames that people are using, what are they actually worried about, and in the design of tools and systems, are there in some cases ways to help allay those fears? And so I'm more experienced with internal organizational design and use. And so, for example, if employees are worried that it will strip them of their discretion or autonomy, you might think more carefully about how you design the tool interface to trigger a prompt reflection, to engage the user in the tool. And I think this is a balance sometimes with efficiency. But I think as you think about user design, pay attention to some of those voice concerns and see whether that helps you build stronger tools for the public sector.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to jump to Mike for this next question. So, as I mentioned, I was with a federal law enforcement agency, and Mike mentioned that people are using AI already, and people in our agencies are using AI already. Who knows what the heck they're putting into ChatGPT and Claude that's work related. What really got my attention was when the AI Corps, again led by Mike Boyce at DHS, created an AI tool called DHS Chat. And basically, it allowed us in federal law enforcement and all the 250,000 people in DHS to use that AI tool safely. So I guess my question, Mike, is operationally, why did you create it? What the heck was DHS Chat? And is there something similar to that can be used by law enforcement in the United States?
Yeah, Josh, it's a really great question. Actually, something that comes up in Sarah in my class, and something that I think people will have a strong reaction to, but that I think it's really important to understand with these generative AI models. The AI part of the generative AI models does not remember what you put into them. Let me repeat that again. The AI models today do not remember what you put into them. They are calculators. They put information in. They basically do multiplication and addition like many trillions of times to what you put in, and then they spit some numbers out, and they do not retain them. They are what we call stateless. They do not remember. The actual model part does not remember it. There's a bunch of people working to change that. If they achieved it, it'd be something called continuous learning. Probably someone would win a Nobel Prize if they figure out how to make the actual model part of it continuously learn. What ends up happening, the way these models learn, is you have a big data set, and there's two moments that happen. There's training, and then there's inference. And inference is what you and I use all day long when we're chatting back and forth with ChatGPT. I send ChatGPT a thing, it does inference, and it gives me a response. Training is a totally separate process where you take a huge amount of data and you essentially run it through the model, and you have the model update based on that training. And you've heard about this training. This is what's costing millions of dollars. These are big things that they do. When they do these huge training runs, it costs millions and millions of dollars. Now, there's ways of tweaking these models as you go along that are faster, but this is not like a thing that you're just trying to willy-nilly do every day based on whatever random junk someone throws into ChatGPT. And so I think people's mental model is when you're chatting with ChatGPT, it's somehow doing something to your data. And there are some personalization features. I'm happy to chat with folks otherwise. These are basically tricks. The underlying AI substrate is not learning from your interactions, but it has ways of essentially changing your prompt basically based on interactions you have. But this is all very transparent stuff. Why did I say all of this? It's because similar to AI, the question of securing data is also not new. It's not a new problem. And in fact, the best training data is things like this conversation we're having right now. This is great training data. ChatGPT has plenty of chats with people asking them about, I don't know, a new recipe to make. What they don't have often is really interesting conversations. And as we're having this conversation right now, where is it going? This conversation is going through the internet, probably to an Amazon or a Microsoft or a Google data center somewhere, and then being routed back to your computer. And you're kidding yourself if you don't think that they can find a way to convert this into text or to train their models on this. So we already have a perception of what data is and is not secure, oftentimes based on our own usage. But anytime you're dealing with the internet, you are potentially creating data that can be trained or sold or manipulated. And so how do we create trust? Well, fortunately, there are standards that have existed now for well over a decade. In the federal space, the most famous one is one called FedRAMP, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, that essentially looks at what different cloud data systems do as a set of controls based on the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And it essentially works with a third-party auditor to make sure that the data system that you are building is in fact secure and that data doesn't leave. And if the companies, at least at the federal level, were to violate that, were to take your data, were to do something with it, there's the False Claims Act. And cases have been brought against companies under the False Claim Act. It's actually a very strong act in that we all have an individual, we can actually bring actions as individuals. So for example, the federal government has set up an agreement with ChatGPT not to train on data, and I, Michael, hear that ChatGPT is in fact violating that agreement, I can bring an action against ChatGPT on behalf of the government and keep a portion of the settlement for myself. So we have actually established really, really strong protections in place for what happens to this data. And the question when you talk about DHS chat was operationalizing that. When we built DHS chat, there had been a couple of services that had actually gone through this FedRAMP process, had basically proven that they've secured the data to the federal government's satisfaction. And we were able to build using a bunch of these different approved services, something that in the end of the day was actually using the exact same AI model as what powers ChatGPT, the exact same one, but through a different interface using a different set of equipment to keep within a federal boundary. What I would say though to law enforcement agencies today is actually those AI companies, your ChatGPT and your Claudes, are getting much, much better at doing the enterprise level of it. And it may actually be more secure than building something custom and in-house. Now, it depends on what your standards are, it depends on what your process is. But I would no longer poo-poo if someone wanted to go directly to ChatGPT and work on their enterprise version. They would want to figure out what their standards are, not only of their ChatGPT data, but everything else they use. Zoom, Microsoft Office, Google Workspace, all of these products are potential sources of training data. And so what I really encourage folks is consistency with how they protect their data, not just for things that feel like AI applications, but really across any of these surfaces. And to make sure you're using these standards, of which there are a number, and have a lot of precedents to make sure that you're protecting your citizens' data. But I would say, honestly, Josh, if I were to do it all over again today, it actually makes me sad that I've heard that they are still using DHS chat at DHS. If I was there today, I would be pushing for us to try to get, whether it's, I mean, which company, it doesn't matter, but I'd be trying to push for us to get one of the enterprise versions and to make sure that we've put it through the battery of security tests and controls. But I think the way we structured it was because it was so new at the time. Only a few companies had gotten their certifications. But today, I think we can have a bit more trust given this pretty strong framework that's been long-standing at the federal level.
I really appreciate that perspective. It'd be interesting. Not only do I not think that the public understands that. I don't think the profession really understands it. And again, just listening to you, it really does give us great perspective. And especially your point that maybe I was thrilled to be able to use DHS chat because I was so frustrated that we were not allowed to use, an AI platform until that was created. So wow, things are moving
Yeah.
fast.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah. I mean, I could say at Maryland, most employees have access to Gemini and can put certain levels of sensitive data into Gemini, as well as we have a couple other options too.
So there are options today for agencies, and they should explore that. Maybe they should take a master's degree course at UVA to learn more, right?
Yes.
Hey, so this next question is for Chief Swoboda, and I had a prepared question, but I'm looking at some of the questions that have come in, and so I'm going to pose this one to you. This is from Shelley Forker, who's a firefighter and emergency manager from Connecticut, and also a master's degree holder from UVA. So, Jeff, if when you're dealing with leaders inside your agency, and you have some leaders that are they're embracing AI rapidly, as the way Shelley describes it, but then there's others that are very critical of it and concerned about it. How do you address that without dismissing either perspective or coming out as anti-AI? So it's really interesting internal operational public agency question about disagreements about AI. How would you approach that as a chief?
Great question as far as talking about it from the AI perspective. But I think when we're talking about this, we've been dealing with this in departments forever, right? Like the lieutenant who's been here 30 years doesn't want to do anything other than A, B, or C, and we don't want computers in the car. So I think it's just the evolution of where this is going. AI is here. We know people are using it. I think at least for our city, we're being really cautious on what it has access to. And I don't have this firsthand, but the head of IT for us is very concerned on just opening it up too much because we have police reports where people say things as a fact and that they in fact are not a fact. It's someone's story or someone accuses someone of a crime or something. And so we just have to be very careful as to what we're going to let people reference as going out and getting information. Internally, I don't know that I have a good answer as far as how you proceed with that. Other than I would make sure we're having open conversations about who's using what systems and for what, and how do we make sure, that decisions are not, because a lot that we're looking at right now, and it might be scary to people, but this idea, and it's not really new, people have been doing this for a while, but I think it's getting better, is this idea of predictive policing. Where should we be on a Monday afternoon when it's 80 degrees and kids are in school? Like, what are the calls for service that historically we have been going to? And so I think if we're using tools such as that, and I know departments are, how do we make sure that we're having that conversation, secretly using that information? So I do think it comes from the top as far as not just the police chief, at least in the police department, but the city manager authorizing what is okay, what is not okay, and then having open discussions to say, here's why I'm not comfortable going down in this space because of A, B, and C. But I do see a lot of people concerned with AI as kind of the boogeyman, and it's scary, and we need to not use it. It's here, people are using it. So now it's just about how do we be transparent internally and with the community that we are using it for these types of things. Like, I'll give you, for instance, we're using it for police reports. There's a service out there we use called Draft One, and it's simply that. It takes the body camera information, identifies what report should be written based on the information that was exchanged, and it gives a draft. We are very intentional to make sure that everyone knows that's a draft. That could never be just submitted. An officer has to look at it. We have to talk. They have to change it. They have to add information. A supervisor has to review it. And so we're not just having certain people using it. It's open to everyone. And so I think as we're introducing new technology, we explain why we're using it. We explain the guardrails around that technology. And then we make sure, the overused term, human in the loop, that somebody is looking at this and making sure it's accurate and moving forward. But the people who just think, we don't want to use it. It's not reliable. It's not consistent, or have all kinds of excuses of why not to be using AI. I think, their time is here, and they just need to make a decision, because the profession, at least as we're talking about policing, and I'm assuming with firefighting as well, it's here. It should be used. It's an efficiency tool. It's a force multiplier. It's just a matter of how we use it and what type of oversight we're putting in place. And lastly, I would just say, making sure we have a very solid policy on what it is, and not just word of mouth that it's okay to use something, that it's in writing, what's okay, what's not okay.
Next question is for Sara, and actually maybe even you, Michael. I'm curious because you are now in the classroom. Our students at UVA are mainly, public safety executives, and you're talking to, people that are in in the trenches, so to speak. What are you hearing from the field? What do you see emerging from the field that you're hearing from the students? And any suggestions for other public safety leaders on what they should be thinking about? Starting with you, Sara.
Well, one thing we've talked a lot about in our classes, and I've had lots of sidebar conversations with public sector leaders, is the value of conceptualizing AI as a whole team issue. And so I think sometimes students come into classes and they're sort of like, oh, this is a technology, and I'm not a tech expert. And I think Michael makes a really good point, like, hey, you need a tech expert in-house. Ideally, you need somebody who can talk with vendors, understand the language, understand the claims, help you navigate that. And I think we then say, and you also need to engage your HR representative if it's relevant, your union rep at the table, because we're talking about changes in job functions, responsibility, training, et cetera. Is your legal counsel and your risk manager engaged, thinking about misuse, possible harms, or legal exposure? Is your command team thinking about where AI truly adds value, and where it might actually add additional burdens, and where it is great for quality control and when it actually poses quality control issues? And so, and then we've talked about public and political leaders, and ultimately for public administrators, it's about the consent of the governed, and it's about working with and on behalf of political leaders. And so I would argue that, again, if we risk sort of seeing that as a whole team approach, then we aren't doing the hard people and process work that needs to happen. And I think that will actually make it a more reliable and trustworthy context, and not just the tech. So we do a lot of that sort of enlarging and thinking about all of these stakeholders with our students.
That's really interesting, Sara. Like, yeah, HR and thinking about HR and how job functions will change. You talked about legal and even having an AI tech expert. I mean, I don't know if police leaders are really looking and thinking about this. Michael, same question to you. What have you learned from your students, and what would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I think Josh, well, I love teaching with this, teaching with Sara, the students, because it also keeps me grounded and just the different perspectives. It's a great class because folks come in with different perspectives there. And I'm almost looking back at the question of sort of AI, sort of dealing with AI skepticism, or also wanting people to think through the AI more. Look, I'm a believer here that, and it happens to me all the time, is I ground myself in the fact that it seems pretty clear. I think there's different numbers, but it does seem that over 1 billion people are using these generative AI chatbots on a weekly basis. And so for context, that's more people than drink a daily cup of coffee. And so sometimes I'll be in these conversations where people will say, well, like, AI is emerging. And I say, is caffeine emerging? Like, sort of, or people say, well, what do people use AI for? Well, it's like, what do they use coffee for? I mean, it is more present in our daily lives in some ways than these foundational things. And so what I'm oftentimes also encouraging the students to do is, I in no way want to say that people must use AI, especially if they would rather not use it for something. But I do encourage people to experiment with it and understand it. And, as someone who spends a lot of time talking about AI, I can pretty clearly and quickly tell when I begin to chat with someone, okay, I can probably profile what someone uses AI for in their daily life in about 3 or 4 minutes of chatting with them about the topic. Because in some cases, really, uh, folks are very, very set, no matter how much, it's great that so many people join this, but no matter how many webinars you attend or YouTube videos you watch or whatever it is, you will not have a sense of how it works and what it's good at and what it's not good at unless you are hands-on. And the funny thing about it is, at its basic, it's actually one of the simplest interfaces in the world. You just talk to it. Actually, for a while, they had 1-800-CHAT-GPT where you could call it on the phone and just chat with it. And so that is what I do encourage folks. That doesn't mean that I'm saying people need to actually use it for critical things or put it into their workflow. It should work with what you want. But I do, in general, want people to understand it. And that's what's been sort of exciting about working with the students, is sort of seeing those different threads of where people do understand what it's able to do and what it's not able to do, and how our own sense making understanding around that comes from that interaction between sort of the broader questions we're asking and then our very intimate personal uses and how we actually are interacting with the technology day to day.
Jeff, I'm going to come to you, but for all three of our panelists, as we get near the last 7 minutes of our webinar, my question I'm going to ask all of you to answer with short snippet answers would be, based on your current knowledge of AI and how it's used today, how do you see AI being used in 3 years, 6 years, and 10 years? I don't know if what do you think? Is there a couple of examples or an example?
Yeah, I don't know if I could get as specific as 3, 6, or 10, but kind of in the foreseeable future here, just in a little bit. I think this idea of predictive policing, what are the calls? I like to say in policing, anything can happen. And we tell our officers that all the time. But in reality, it's the same 15 to 20 things that happen all the time. And you could think of a really elaborate story that happens where you're like, wow, that's a once in a lifetime call. Those don't happen daily, obviously, because they're once in a lifetime calls. So I think the systems are going to get very good at, and they already are in many respects, identifying where police officers should be at certain times of day and us getting better in that space. I think also just with more of the sensors and this whole idea around smart cities and traffic calming and red light cameras, all of those things, being able to identify, you see some street takeovers happening in some major cities, entire large groups of people showing up and taking over an intersection. I think the sensors that people have that run the camera systems, whether just cameras for security, or these are the ones that change the red light cameras or change based on traffic. I think those recognizing that something is going on, all of a sudden there's an increase of volume at this intersection, automatically dispatching cars to those intersections. So I do see just really around the technology. And then the last piece that I'm a big supporter of and proponent of are drones. I do see as calls for service are coming in. Right now, we're launching drones, and the technology really is already there to identify what type of calls for service automatically get a drone launch. Some of the best uses of the drones that we're seeing are just understanding the lay of the land before an officer arrives on scene. So if you get a call of a simple call that we get, dozens of times a day of a traffic crash, just automatically recognizing there was a traffic crash, which means let's get a drone up, let's identify, are people injured, are people moving around, the systems being able to identify whether or not someone is laying on the ground. So I know you said try and keep it somewhat short. That's what I would see. It'd be our response times, getting real-time information from the field for drones. And then lastly, getting better at where officers should be at what time of day based on history.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Look, the thing that Sarah and I have started to do in all of our classes is in the beginning of the class, like we did this for our last term, is I basically asked the class to tell me an idea for a website. And then before the end of the class, I basically have AI deploy that website live before the class session is over so people can click on it and see it while we're teaching it to prove that I didn't, secretly turn around and make the website as it was happening. And the reason I am saying this is because what I think is going to change is if we go back to the 1950s, the medium of work for most kind of white collar sort of desk jobs, we had technical mastery over for most middle managers because it was paper. We could conceptualize and understand the technical requirements of sending paper around an office with a filing system. And as computers have developed more and more and more, we've had to abstract and push that, the people who can control those mediums of work, to other more specialized folks. I think what I imagine changing, what I think is all we're already starting to see change, is that AI will in some ways let non-technical folks take back that medium of work. We will less and less have to buy the low code platform because it's so incredibly hard to build software. And we'll be able to more and more define kind of the workflow and the environments and the ways that we are communicating with each other, sort of more out of the box. Same with data, same with all of these things where we need to right now do these very complicated projects to map, because the medium of work is something that only technical specialists can really master. And so I think that is really where I imagine, and that should be empowering to police offices. It won't be central IT anymore that will be able to sort of define what you're able to do and not. You will have both more responsibility over that, but also more mastery and control over sort of what your fate looks like. And it's a real question for a relationship to vendors too, as we less and less need to theoretically rely on these very, very exquisite vendors to provide us these very bespoke solutions. So that is where I imagine things heading over the next few years.
Okay. Well, I think my last word, I will say that all of us, including academics, are notoriously poor at predicting how big innovation unfolds over years. So I'm not even going to pretend to go out 6 or 10 years. I am thinking a lot about the factors that could change this story. And so we could talk about an uneven rollout becoming more even, agencies figuring out what are the sort of highest reward, lowest risk uses, making things that have taken a lot of manual time, allowing the force multiplier effect that Chief Swoboda suggested. And if there are huge events, punctuating events where a system is used inappropriately in a wildly public way, or we have crises in terms of the courts and decisions about the technology use and questions about evidentiary trustworthiness and procedure. All of those represent potential positive U-turns. So I think I would go on the record saying that it's going to be pretty uneven, and there will be some big unexpected curveballs in the next 3 to 4 years. And so being aware that we are working through this in a fairly volatile and uncertain time, I think is an important thing.
Thank you, Sarah. I know Michael had to go. Thank you all of the attendees for listening in.